Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. Today's is the first of a set of 3 videos which is going to be looking at studying. This doesn't mean just academic studying for classes, but any type of studying and or homework when you want to be working or learning on your own. One of the hallmarks of adult education, whether you're looking at college or you're looking at a professional study, learning a new topic, for instance, is that you're going to have to be able to study and work efficiently. And so the first task that we're going to be doing, and today's, which is the difference between studying and homework, along with an example of how studying and homework is different and why both are needed, but when you're planning to be preparing for a test, for instance, whether it's a professional test or an academic test, or you're just doing something on your own to learn a new topic, that you really should be working to include both a homework activity and the studying activity into doing it together. Even within the teaching profession, oftentimes studying and homework is used interchangeably, but they're actually 2 different things. And I'll put some links down below for those that are interested to go and see a couple different explanations of what it is. Next week, we're going to be looking at taking effective notes. One of the issues, and I'll address this again next time, is that many times when I teach new students, particularly students that are fresh into college, I tend to teach a lot of the first year courses. Then what happens is that the students just kind of take notes in what I call the scattershot method. They just put down almost like a stream of consciousness whatever the people say, and that's not necessarily the most effective means. Or perhaps you're going to take the notes, but then you have to organize them afterwards. You don't want to be in a situation where you take notes and then when you go to look at them later, and I've done this myself, you end up scratching your head and you don't know what that note is that you took. And then finally, we need to be efficient. What I tell the students is stop wasting your time. Don't waste your time. It's not just a matter of prioritizing. That is part of it. But a common complaint that students will tell me, and even occasionally some of my peers will say, I've studied 4 or 5 hours for a test and I don't think it worked out. Or I studied for a test but it wasn't what I needed, or it wasn't or it took me way too long to be able to get this material. And while it's possible that it's a learning block that is preventing you from doing that, they do occur. Many times it's that people are not efficient with their studying and they just take way too long for a moderate increase. There's no point in studying for 6 hours for a 10-point increase when you still have 90 points that you have to worry about. Part of that can be taking effective notes. Part of that can be not understanding studying and homework. And some of it is just a organizational or prioritizing problem. So these are the 3 areas that we're going to be covering over the next 3 videos. We're going to be looking right now at number 1 here, which is studying and homework. And when we're looking at studying and homework, we're looking at studying is more a free-form activity, and homework is the structured activity. So if I'm studying for a composition test, then I've been given an assignment such as read a story and then write a persuasive thesis and 3 topic sentences with a conclusion for that class. Not necessarily the whole essay, but if you can write your thesis sentence, which is going to guide your work, the 3 topic sentences underneath it, and the conclusion, I can be fairly confident as a composition instructor that you'll be able to do that assignment. So that's the structured homework, where you're going to get clear directions. This is what you need to do. You need to show this, and it's often going to be turned in either for a grade or that you've completed that assignment. Studying, on the other hand, is something that you want to be doing to be able to learn and gain material, and it can be any range of things, any number of ideas that will help you learn that material. And no one really studies the same. You're going to study a little different than other people. This can be a problem because we typically learn how to study by copying what other people do. Either our parents or our friends or even another teacher. But if it hasn't been adjusted to ourselves, that's not going to necessarily help. So one thing that we're going to need to do is understand how we learn. Now, I have previous videos that talk about learning modalities, for instance, but it's a good idea to include a range of different activities so that you're able to focus in on the areas that you want. One of the problems with studying can be that when you are studying material or you're practicing material, we tend to practice the things that we're good at and reinforce our strengths because that's what we like to do. On the other hand, that can become an issue because it's the things that I don't want to do which are probably a larger problem. It's also worth noting that studying is typically theory, and application is typically your homework. So I'm doing the homework, I do the English composition by the topic sentences and the thesis, I've learned those parts, and now I'm going to apply that into solving multiple problems. Or maybe I'm going to do that 5-sentence structure for that composition assignment of a thesis, a conclusion, and the intermediate 3 topic sentences. And I'm going to do that for 3 different topics, and then I'm going to eventually pick one of those topics. Particularly with late high school and students that are entering into college, I personally, when I teach composition, do not like to have the students start with, write me a 5-paragraph essay. Because that assumes that they have the theory underneath the 5-paragraph essay and they're familiar with the application of how to put that theory into practice. And instead, I like to build up the assignment in small, digestible chunks. We'll just kind of add things in slowly. That can be the same with any of your topics, whether it's anatomy and physiology. It could be a mathematical assignment. it could be Photoshop, which is what this is currently hosted in. So this is part of it. Now let's go back to our studying and let's put in just a quick sample. So I'm going to put in a math test on fractions. This will be a fairly simple issue. Now, the homework would be a sample problem similar to the test. So if my fraction is, in this case, I don't know, 3/4, and I'm going to add 7/8. And so let me just stick in a plus sign here. And actually, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to just temporarily move up my math problem to give me a little more space. And I'm just going to use the brush, I'll use the pencil, to let me create a new layer here, to just put in a quick little part there. So I would solve the problem, and in this particular one, I know that, let me put in my equal signs. When I help people in math, I work as a math tutor at times, and when I help people in math, one of the biggest problems that students have is that they don't spend time organizing their problem. So in this particular one, we know that we need the 8 here in the denominator location. And we know that this one's going to be 7 in the numerator. And then 8 is divided by 4, giving us a 2, which is going to multiply by the 3 to give us a 6. And then we're going to add these together to be 13/8. Now, if the directions were to say that you need to turn this into a proper fraction, then I would do so. And since 8 does not go into 13 evenly to 2, it would be 1 and, what is that? 5? 1 and 5/8. But as I tell the students in math classes when they come for tutoring, is that if the directions were not to change it into a mixed number, don't do it. Because when you get into fields such as engineering or physics, you change it over into your proper mixed number, and then in order for anyone to work with it in the next step of the problem, you're going to have to change it back into this. This is a perfectly acceptable answer in some fields. It depends what the homework problem is. So this is one way of doing homework, and I'm probably going to solve a number of them. And if this came off of a worksheet that I'm going to be turning in, that's the application portion, it's the homework. I'm showing my instructor, or I'm showing to myself with the use of an answer key that I'm capable of solving these problems. But this isn't the studying. And one of the issues that can come up when I work with students in tutoring is that they believe that the structured homework is the same as studying. So when I talk to them about, well, how would you learn how to study? And I'll just make up a name, Rex. So how are you learning to study, Rex? Rex will answer, well, I pull down a sheet or I take some sample problems from my textbook and I write them out and practice them, and that way I learn. Which is true, but it's not the complete answer. What is actually happening is that person, Rex, has given himself more homework to do. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not necessarily the most efficient way. So let's look at a different thing. I'm just going to delete all of this. Okay. And I'm going to hide the homework, and instead we're going to look at studying. Learn the rules. Whether you're in English composition essays have rules. Typically, in a 5-paragraph essay, the last sentence of the first paragraph is in fact your thesis sentence. The first sentence of your intermediate paragraphs is your topic sentence. The last sentence of your intermediate paragraphs is your transitional phrase into the second topic sentence. The first sentence of your 5th paragraph, your last paragraph, is a conclusion, which is a restatement of what you have just presented, which typically means a rewording of the topic sentence. And the end of that paragraph in your 5th position is adding a little bit extra to it, or talking about why it is important to do this, or adding in, this is what further this particular paper opens up for further discussion, for I would like to know more about, depending upon what that assignment is. Math is the same way. In actual fact, I find math to be much more clear in rules. So, if we take a problem and I say I would like the problem 3/4 and, I don't know, 5/3. I'm just kind of making stuff up here. And I'm going to subtract that in this particular time. And then I'm going to use my pencil to draw in some fairly messy lines here across. And let me add in here an equal sign. And I'm going to put in another equal sign here. Now I have a problem. But I can sit here and do different problems, 30 problems. And while that's great homework practice, it is not the same as studying. Because in a studying context, I'm not doing a structured homework. What I'm going to do instead is learn the rules. So if I was going to solve this problem, and again, this is a fairly simple problem in fractions, what would be the first thing that I do? Well, most of you will have identified that what I need to do is I need to find the common denominator, right? And that means I have to know that the numerator is the top number in a fraction and the denominator is the lower number in the fraction. If this was a mixed number, I have to turn it over into an improper fraction. Sometimes the rule is that you want to find the lowest common denominator, the LCD. And that's true in that it will make your work easier. But if you can't find it, the most important thing to do is to find the common denominator, which in this case would be 12. If I didn't see 12 and I decided I wanted to go with 24, I could solve that problem. I'm just going to have to do some reducing at the end. So after this part, I have to be able to describe to myself what the rule is. I advocate that when students are studying, they write out the rule. And then they check to make sure that rule is correct. That in math, as well as English or learning a software program or anatomy, you learn what the rules are of whatever the operation is that you're going to take place. So in this case, 12 is divided by 3 and ends up 4 times. All right, that's my quotient, which is 4. I'm going to multiply it by the original numerator. 4 times 5 is 20. That gives me my new numerator, 20, which I have to move down just a little bit. And then I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to take the new numerator, 12, I'm going to divide it by 4 for a quotient of 3. I'm going to multiply by the old numerator, so 3 times 3 is 9, and my new numerator is 9. And now I'm going to end up with 29 by doing I'm doing subtraction, aren't I? Always check your signs. It needs to go into mine. And so when I have 20 subtracted from 9, I'm going to end up with negative 11. And I need to draw a little bit there. And then I'm going to not add the denominators or subtract, and ends up with 12. So I have negative 11/12 in this particular problem. The rules of whatever subject you're doing is a good example of studying. Homework is the application of those problems. I do the odds in a textbook from 1 to 20, which would actually become 1 to 19, which should be 10 problems. But that's not necessarily going to teach me the rules. But the nice thing about math is the rules shouldn't change. Now, in reality, they will. Because what often happens in our education system is that we teach in steps without explaining that we're going to be teaching in steps. This is a peeve that I have with the way that we teach mathematics. I was taught originally in elementary school that you can't take away something that you don't have, which many adults will say, well, we can because we go into debt. Yes, we can take away more than we have. You end up with negative numbers. Or you'll have learned that, well, you can't take a square root of a negative number. I can't solve, for instance, students will have learned, you can't solve something like negative 9, which Others of you will say, well, wait a minute. That answer becomes 3i. So we can solve it. We can do it. Right? And I standing for imaginary number sets. But in actual fact, this was the original rule we should have learned back in the beginning. This is where I tend to have conflicts with math teachers, and I will very politely show up sometimes at the doors and say, why are we learning, or why has the student learned that you can't do this operation which you absolutely can do? It would be better in the long term, but more complicated in the short term, to explain to students, in this math class, we're not going to deal with the negatives under the square root sign. Rather than saying, you can't do it. Because if you work at the college where I am and you tell the students you can't do this, and by the way, this has happened, and then the student shows up down with me and says, well, you know, we can't do that, I'll be like, and who's your instructor? I'm not going to argue with the student about what the instructor said. It's not the student's fault. But I am going to go up and ask the instructor. Because the rules really shouldn't change in math. We would do a far better job in math, in English. They don't really change in English either. In Photoshop, in anatomy, physiology, in any subject you want, when we learn the rules, those rules should be the same. And they should stay the same. They don't, largely due to, whoops, didn't mean to choose that one. Hang on. They change in rules simply because we simplify things sometimes to the point. And when I was going through my doctoral work, one of the things that I ran into is that there are teachers in primary and secondary education that believe that kids are not smart enough to understand that there are different problem sets that we do at different levels of education. If you've watched my video on intelligence, you will probably know what I think of that idea. So, one of the things that we need to do when we study is we learn the rules, and then when we're doing the homework, we do the sample problems. And let me just separate that out a little bit. Doing sample problems, whether it's in composition or reading comprehension or ASL sign language, and learning the rules for that are two separate things. If you're finding that your studying doesn't seem to be effective, that you're studying for a test, you've worked 5 hours on a test, and then you take the test and you didn't do well at it, the very first place that I suggest that people start is, how is your homework and how is your studying working? Because sometimes when I ask this question, people will say, well, I did 50 problems. Okay. That's great, and that was an excellent try for a lot of work. Did you happen to study the rules? And oftentimes they did not. Well, I don't really like writing out the rules. I don't really see that that helps me. Or they didn't learn the rules, right? Those fraction problems are the same. Whether you have 365 over 12 times 458th over 32, and I'm going to solve that problem, and it's going to be a messy complication problem that's going to need multiple reductions probably. But the rules for multiplication of fractions are the same no matter what that fraction happens to be. The composition, if you learn the 5-paragraph essay that we discussed, where you have the topic sentence, excuse me, you have the thesis sentence, the 3 topic sentences, and the conclusion, forming the framework for your 5-paragraph essay. When you expand that out into later work, and now you're writing 5, 6, 7, 100 pages, you're going to have perhaps not a thesis sentence, you're going to have a pocket paragraph. You'll have your introductory paragraph, and then you'll have an entire paragraph that's going to say what I'm going to cover in the next couple of sentences. If you're writing a 200-page paper, you don't necessarily have a single thesis sentence. You usually have a guiding sentence, and you have a paragraph underneath it. But we don't give students, typically, I can't imagine, a assignment when they come into their first year of college. I want you to go home and write 100 pages. I would expect to lose 98% of the class. And that's because we haven't gone over the rules, we're just throwing them into the wolves. This is also a fair point that teachers really should not be giving studying without understanding, go home and learn this on your own. That is not conducive to learning. Both studying and homework, particularly in the academic realms, means that it has been introduced to you. So if I was to tell a student, well, we didn't get to this, but I want you to go home, learn it on your own, and when you come back, we'll have a test on it. That's truthfully bad instruction. And I think we do need to, as educators, call out our fellow educators that that is not really being very helpful. If people are studying and they get the exact same feeling from studying as going home and repeatedly slamming their head against a concrete wall, we're not helping. In fact, they are learning something. What they're learning is they don't like studying, and they probably don't like homework. And they don't like it because they don't know how to do it. Now, if I was to tell the student, you know, we really needed to get to this problem, but we didn't. So I'd like you to go home, read over it, and then tomorrow we're going to discuss it before the test. That's a slightly different thing. I've had cases where we were just not able to get through the assigned curriculum, and those problems showed up on the test. The way I dealt with it is, being in New York, where we have academic freedom, is I just eliminate those problems from the test. I'm not going to hold students responsible for work that I haven't introduced. There are other ways to handle that, but that's on the instructor. For our purposes in here, when we're looking at homework, homework is your application. Studying is your theory. So if I put my theory down here, and I put my applications back up here, This is what studying and homework is. And I find that understanding this part right up in the beginning will help students understand what they are doing, particularly adult students. There's a tendency for people to treat adult students and child students as the same things, and it isn't. For adult students, they want to understand why they're learning a certain way. For children, I personally believe that we should also be teaching them we're going to learn a certain way, but children perceive time differently than adults. And so, therefore, we have to teach slightly differently, partly based on the time. So, if this was helpful to you, you can give me a like. Next week, what we're going to do, and let me remove these temporarily, and next week what we're going to focus on is taking effective notes. We'll be looking at both ways to take strategies for taking notes in different subjects. Probably we'll be taking notes in a some sort of logical or mathematical. We need to look at taking notes for a composition, which I spelled wrong. Composition still looks wrong. Okay, composition or a writing intensive class. And we're going to have to take notes on something that is terminology heavy. As aside for this, when I took computer classes, my specialization is instructional technology, and I had to take quite a few computer classes. They're filled with terminology. And so one of the ways that I studied is I used index cards. And knowing, for instance, what RAM is, random access memory, is not really helpful. Knowing what the rule is for RAM and how to insert it and how has RAM changed over the different generations of computers is slightly more helpful. I gave a stack of index cards that I would create flashcards, and I gave them the ones that I couldn't do, and I gave them to my sister, who was, I think she was in middle school maybe at the time, and I made a deal that for everyone that I got wrong, and she would just surprise me, for everyone that I got wrong, she would get a candy bar. I think that right now she probably still has candy bars. So there is definitely strategies for being able to study and make it relatively fun. Right? I was not going to sit there. I don't have the patience to sit there and do index cards and flip through them for an hour. If you do, that's wonderful, but I can't do that. So instead, I set up a scenario where my sister could be like a trap spider, and as I'm walking down the hall, she could say, "Quick! What is RAM? What does it mean? What's a PCI card slot? How many pins is on a DIMM?" And invariably, I'd end up giving her a candy bar. But when it came to the test, I knew those answers. And I didn't just get 100 on the test. That strategy worked for me and I was able to graduate from that computer degree as valedictorian. So being able to find an effective means to study is important. And also, next week, we're going to be looking at taking effective notes. Take care, and I hope I see you next week.